Okay, so this is the Federalist era, talking about the time with George Washington and John Adams as president. If you'd like to use a review, you can also look at a series called The Presidents and watch the videos about Washington and Adams. It's from the History Channel. So these are a lot of the problems that we've got with this new country. You can read through those. These are interesting facts about Washington. You can read through those. This is a story about how Hampstead may have got its name. Here we can see that Washington coming into power, he's not sure about it. There's a lot of questions to be asked and answered. And, we're building this thing as we're flying the plane kind of situation. First thing you have to do is he has to have advisors. He knows that he needs that support. So number one talks about the advisors that he has, his Secretary of State, Treasury, War. So you need to be familiar with them and what they do. One thing they had to agree upon immediately was a Bill of Rights, because the Anti-Federalists had said that they would not support the Constitution unless that was done. So they're going to pass these first 10 Bill of Rights, freedom of speech and all those. You can look over those. Number 10 is the one that we'll be talking about the most, because it's the right reserved to the states' rights. And that's what's going to lead us eventually into the Civil War. Okay, the Judiciary Act of 1789, you should also have looked this up. This helps to organize the Supreme Court. You'll need to know how. John Jay is the first Chief Justice. Alexander Hamilton is going to be the right-hand man of Washington. Some think that he was setting himself up for power as Secretary of State. Secretary of Treasury. Jefferson was State. What Hamilton wants is an economic policy that includes the wealthy, because you've got to have their support. Look at all the debt listed here, 54, 42. All this debt's got to be paid for by someone, and you have to get the wealthy involved in having an incentive to do that by being involved in the country. So he's going to develop an economic plan. The first part is funding, which is where we're going to take the old bonds that we had sold during the Revolutionary War and issue new bonds. So what's going to happen is, instead of being paid immediately, the government can put off that payment a little bit later. The problem is, many thought those bonds were worthless anyway. When the funding plan got out, some people think Hamilton's people may have spread word to others so they could make a lot of money off of this. They would go and buy up those, what they called worthless bonds, knowing that one day they'd be redeemed for higher money. So speculation was a problem. Excuse me. State debt assumption. The states had a lot of debt, and the federal government said, we are going to take all that debt away from you. The South had very little debt. The North had a lot more, so they weren't really happy with this. So they decided to make an agreement. What the agreement was, the South would agree to all the state debt assumption as long as the nation's capital was in the South. And as far south as they were willing to go was the Potomac area of Virginia, which is why we have the capital, Washington, D.C., where it is. Hamilton also wants to help pay for the debt by selling off all the western lands that we had. So the government could own that land, sell it off, and help pay off the debt they owed to the Europeans. That way there would not be raising the taxes, and it would hurt the people less. Okay, you should have questions related to this as well. You have excise taxes, you have tariffs. If you're not sure how a tariff works, here it is right here. This is what we talked about with the controversy with funding. And then the last part would be a national bank. National bank would have national currency. We still had state currency floating around, but they want a federal currency, stable money, and the interest would help pay for the funded debt. Jeffersonians did not like it that much. They thought it was only helping the wealthy. One of the reasons that he said he could do this was because of a clause in the Constitution called the Elastic Clause, or the Necessary and Proper Clause, which you should have information about for number 6. It's not explicitly written in the Constitution, but it's necessary and proper to make the country work. So these are the 5 parts of his plan you need to know: the funding, debt assumption. These three are the most important: excise tax, protective tariff, national bank. Washington is going to sign these into law. You can read over that. This is the Whiskey Rebellion. I'll show you the video. You can listen to it while you read through this.
You might remember George Washington as a great general and the father of our country. What you might not know is that he was also the man behind America's first big push west. It's 1791, and this is what the country looks like. We won the Revolutionary War. America's a free nation. George Washington is our president, and everything is just peachy keen. That is until the bill for the war came due. It's huge, over $75 million. So Washington agrees to an ingenious scheme to pay it off. A tax on whiskey. Taxes are never popular, but this one got folks really worked up because it wasn't a tax on people who drank whiskey. No, this was a tax on the people who make it. And a lot of those distillers were just poor farmers who counted on the cash they made turning corn into whiskey. So the tax hit them where it hurt them most, their wallet.
Okay, so a little overview there. Hamilton's plan was working. You can read through this. Adam Smith, you can read through this. This is going to support the idea of supply and demand. Government stay out of economics. We're going to begin to have more and more factions or divisions, political parties develop. Washington did not support the idea of having two groups like the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, who used to be called the Anti-Federalists. It's going to further divide Washington and his cabinet. The French Revolution, you have a question on that. You can read through this. One thing that Washington wanted to make sure he did was stay neutral. So when France and Britain were going to war, Washington said, nope, we are not getting involved. When it was issued without Congress being consulted, Jefferson said, nope, don't like that, and he resigned as Secretary of State. You can read through this. You can read through this as well. We are going to begin to have more conflicts with the natives. One of the main guys that we have a conflict with are the Miami tribe in the Northwest Territory, current Ohio, Illinois, Indiana. One of the leaders, Little Turtle, defeated our army twice, was very well organized. So they're going to send this guy to go find and stop them. A large number of native forces there. But eventually the Miami Confederation was defeated in the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. This led to the Treaty of Greenville, which you should have information on already for this area here, the Northwest Territory. Now, while all this is going on, Britain is getting more involved again. We've already beaten them, but now they're starting to attack our trading ships and impressing or taking our sailors off of our ships to work on their ships. We began to sell public land out west. We have 3 new states join. So to stop this impressment, we send John Jay to make a treaty with Britain. And you have information on that. The treaty was not popular. It was a failure. It did not remove the troops that were stationed in the forts by the British in the Northwest Territory, nor did it stop impressment. Pekinese Treaty should have this as well. This treaty with Spain to allow us use up and down the Mississippi, and know why that's significant. So Washington serves 2 terms, and he says, you know what, I'm done. I'm not a king. And this established a 2-term tradition that stayed until 1940 with FDR. By his second term, Hamilton was gone, Jefferson was gone. He was being attacked on both sides, and he was done. I mean, he'd served his time, no problem. When he left, he said several things in his farewell address. So make sure you're aware of what he says with that, number 12, and you may also read the document for that. His legacy is huge. You know, he kept us out of war. He kept the country together over 8 years. We did not fall apart. And if he had been elected a 3rd time, he may have died in office. So that would have been Could have been a catastrophe. The question is, who's going to come after Washington? Washington did also help design the Capitol, even though he never lived in Washington, D.C. So the next cat is John Adams, his vice president. Also a Federalist. This will be the last Federalist president. You can read through this. Very important, peaceful transition of power. And his vice president was from the other party, Thomas Jefferson, with the Democratic Republicans, because it used to be whoever came in first was president and second was vice president. Vice president. And that will change. The Democratic Republicans also began to focus on more of the immigrants coming in to gain votes. So you can see here, look at all these people running for office. Some disliked Adams and supported Hamilton instead. So you have a faction or a split within the Federalist Party itself with the supporters of Hamilton. John Marshall will be appointed eventually Supreme Court Justice by John Adams. This will strengthen the power of the Supreme Court, and he will be on the court for a long time. We'll be talking about this guy for a while. This is a great painting of him. If you were to blow it up, his eyes seem to follow you everywhere. Creepy.
Angry at U.S. neutrality in the British-French conflict, the French had attacked a number of American ships. It was a big problem for President John Adams. Attacking American ships. What shall I do? I must send smart diplomats to negotiate with French Foreign Minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Perrigot. We are three smart diplomats. We want to negotiate. Please send us to France. My dream has come true. Surely Charles Whitney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry will successfully negotiate. Well, what are you waiting for? Get to work. Consider it done, Mr. President. This is cool. Children are diplomats. Here come the foreign minister's representatives. Let us report to them as X, Y, and Z. So you want us to leave your ships alone? Ah, yes we do. How much? I'd say pretty much. Enough to offer us a ride. Get lost, pal. France is a powerful country. You better pay. Rather fight an expensive war than pay you some stupid crime. We save billions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. You'll be sorry. When Americans got word of how disrespectfully they'd been treated by the French, many wanted to go to war. George Washington was ready to come out of retirement to lead the army. Adams, however, tried further negotiation, and this time, France treated America seriously. The XYZ affair, so named because that's how Americans referred to the French representatives who demanded a bribe, showed the world that the United States demanded to be treated with respect.
All right, so that gives you everything about the XYZ affair. So that leads to a quasi-war, kind of like a semi-war. We were going to fight if we saw each other, but weren't making a big deal out of it. For a couple of years, a non-declared war with France. Good for the Federalists who were anti-French, bad for the Democratic Republicans who were pro-French. It is during this time that the Navy was created, Department of the Navy. It ends with a negotiation and a new minister and the Convention of 1800. And you can read through this. Now, what's important about this is Adams sought out peace with the French, which many in his party wanted to go to war at one point with the French. But two things happened. First of all, he kept the country out of war, another important thing, and he set in motion the negotiations that would later allow us to purchase Louisiana. And Adams actually had a very high popularity rate at this point. Then came the Alien and Sedition Acts. So you should already have information on what those were.
Well, in 1798, the United States, under the presidency of John Adams, was involved in what was called the quasi-war with France. France and England were at war. The United States wasn't fully at war, but it was engaged in certain naval battles with France, and there was fear of a broader war. Congress, under the control of the Federalist Party, passed these Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act basically gave the president the right to deport any immigrant he wanted, largely because the Federalist Party thought a lot of these immigrants coming into the 1790s were radical Jeffersonians who were voting for the Jeffersonian Republican Party. The Sedition Act basically made it a federal crime to criticize the government. As in other wars, the government doesn't like criticism, and it defines criticism of its policies as unpatriotic, as seditious, etc. So the Sedition Act made it possible for the federal government to prosecute and jail particularly newspaper editors who criticized the Adams administration. It was mostly a political measure. I mean, these newspapers weren't doing anything which had any effect on the quasi-war with France, but an election was coming up 2 years later, the election of 1800. The Jeffersonian Party was rising, and the Adams administration was trying to crush out political opposition. Somewhere between 10 and 15 newspaper editors actually were put on trial under the Sedition Act, and some of them were thrown in jail. The most famous was Matthew Lyon, a member of Congress from Vermont, who also edited a newspaper very strongly anti-Adams, and he was actually convicted under the Sedition Act and jailed for a while. But the reaction against this was very strong and actually contributed to the election of Jefferson in 1800, when the slogan of the Jeffersonians was Jefferson and Liberty. And one of the things they meant by liberty was rescinding the Alien and Sedition Acts, which they did soon after getting into office.
Okay, so you can see from the video some of the results of that. You can read this as well. Congress actually two people responded, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. They're going to respond with these pamphlets, these essays called the Virginia-Kentucky Resolutions. And they said that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional and that a state had the right to nullify a federal law if it didn't believe in it. So this is supporting what's called the compact theory of government, small government. This is the same idea that the southern states will use before the Civil War. I'm sure that Jefferson and Madison didn't intend to do that, but this example of nullification will be pushed again soon. Read that. The Federalist Party began to lose power because of these things. We would be doing a project on these two groups if we had had time, but you need to know the difference between this party and this party. There's a great chart in your AMSCO that helps with that. Read through this, read through this, read through this, and same thing. So at this point in American history, who could vote? You had to be free, white, 21 male landowners. All right.